Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have Susan Mattern. Susan is a distinguished research professor at the University of Georgia. She teaches and writes on origins and history of property, small-scale egalitarian societies, along with the histories of Greece, Rome, and ancient Egypt. She is the author of the most recent book, The Slow Moon Climbs, The Science, History, and Meaning of Menopause. I read this book maybe about a year after it came out, and I really read it out of curiosity and really loved it. And she was kind enough to come on and talk all about it. In this conversation, we start by talking about her reasons and motivations for writing the book. We talk about the two main definitions of menopause and what people mean when they talk about menopause. We talk about some of the origins of menopause and where it started and how it really is unique to humans. We spend some time talking about the grandmother hypothesis, which is the leading hypothesis for understanding menopause. We also talk about the role of mothers-in-law and how they are uniquely placed within the family system. We talk about how we've evolved into a patriarchal society during the agriculture societies, and how we still have remnants of that now, and how it looks different and how things change over time. And it's a very nice, honest, and balanced conversation on that bit, and also about the gendered roles of labor within society. And we finished the conversation by talking about, is menopause a cultural syndrome? What that could mean and what that looks like, and some of the positive ways of understanding this stage of a woman's life. Susan was absolutely wonderful. She was very kind. She's absolutely brilliant, and I really enjoyed this conversation a lot. And I hope everyone enjoys it as well and buys her book. And now I bring you Susan Mattern. I am here with Susan Mattern. How's it going, Susan? Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, we were talking before, and I've read your book, Slow Moon Climbs, The Science, History, and Meaning of Menopause. I've read it twice. It's very, very good, and about a subject that I did not know too much about. And I've had a few people that have also read it and really enjoyed it. So I'm absolutely thrilled that you're taking the time to talk about it.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited to hear that you read it twice. That's really amazing. And as I was saying before, I am excited that I'm excited to hear that men are reading, or at least one man is reading the book.
Yes. Yes.
I think that the title, menopause is a very off-putting subject. It's a mortifying subject for women, and it's a subject that men think doesn't relate to them. But I think what the book shows is that both of these things are untrue. Menopause is a really interesting subject, important for both men and women.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's kind of what I realized reading your book and having a few conversations with some people in my life about it as well. So just tell listeners just a brief snapshot of who you are, what you do, your background. I'll give you a proper introduction in the beginning, but just kind of tell us from you what you do, your interest, and anything else you got going on.
I am a professor of history at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. And so my job is to teach history and write books about history. And I've written books about Roman imperialism, about a physician named Galen, or a couple books about him, who lived during the Roman imperial period. And most recently I wrote this book about menopause. It was a new, different subject for me. And I liked that. I wanted to write a world history type book. That's hard to do early in your career, but I'm at the point right now where I can be a little more adventurous in the subjects that I choose to write about.
Yeah. So you're, by training, you're a historian. You teach it, you write it. That's what you do. And
Yes.
that's really interesting, because reading the book, I can definitely see that kind of hat that you're wearing, that lens, but it is, I mean, you're dealing I thought quite well, topics that are outside of, I think, of history. I mean, evolution and science and some biology, and then there's just so much that's in the book that's, I would assume that's outside the world of history proper. So, I mean, that must have been interesting.
So historians can use lots of different methods, and we can use methods from other disciplines. Not everybody does. Most historians just work really closely with texts, but I wanted to take a different approach. I had to learn a bunch of other disciplines. These are disciplines where I didn't make original contributions, but I felt that there's so much siloing in academia. So we have researchers working on this subject in anthropology and in medicine and in different subjects, different disciplines, that their findings weren't all coming together, and nobody was putting together sort of the totality of what we know about menopause and trying to explain how it fits all together. And that's unfortunate. There's, especially in medicine, that there's not more of a interdisciplinary perspective, that doctors aren't really aware of the kind of research that's being done on menopause in other fields. And one thing I hope to achieve with the book, probably over ambitious and not going to happen, is that more medical professionals will have a broader perspective on menopause.
Yeah. You definitely do I think the amount of time you take to tell the full story, like literally the story and history of menopause. And then when you get to the last third of the book, where you're discussing how that is in the modern age and with, kind of traditional and modern medicine is really, really important. So, which we'll hopefully get to.
Yes, and one thing I want to say is that it's okay to skip parts of the book if you want to. If you find, I did write it in this way, like it is very long and methodical, a methodical way. I was working through certain kinds of problems. They're all really big problems, and I think they're really interesting problems that some people find some parts more interesting than other parts, and that's why it's in 3 parts and it's in 12 chapters. And if you don't like a chapter, you can skip to the next chapter or skip to the chapter that talks about what you're interested in at the moment. And then hopefully maybe you might come back to the other chapters. But it's fine if readers are frustrated that they're bogged down in things that they didn't expect to read about. That's fine to skip those chapters and go to the end.
Yeah, it definitely feels that way. Each thing kind of can sit on its own, each part, but it can also work really well together. So yeah, that definitely feels that way as well. I guess before we get into it, what was your, inspiration, personal inspiration, if you will, for writing about menopause? Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a really good question. And there are so many reasons why I decided to do this. There were lots of deterrents why I might not want to do this. When I mentioned this subject, my agent said, well, can we maybe not have menopause in the title of the book? It was like, I know where he's coming from. It's like people see that word and they just cringe, but I couldn't figure out how to keep it out of the title and still have it come up on Google searches for people who are looking for that subject. So we did have to put menopause somewhere in the title. But there were many reasons why I decided to write it. And one is that when I first got the idea for the book, I was approaching menopause. I wasn't there yet. And now, many years later, I'm on the other side of it. But at the time, I had sort of absorbed my society's ideas about menopause. And yet at the same time, because I'm a historian, I knew that people hadn't always thought that way about menopause. And certainly in the cultures that I studied, it wasn't even a thing. There wasn't, menopause was just not a thing. Menopause as we know it wasn't a concept. Yeah. And so I was really curious, well, does that mean, what does that mean? Does this mean that, maybe there's another way to think about it? Maybe these mostly really negative ideas we have about menopause, this construct of menopause that we have isn't the only way to think about it. And maybe it's not even right. And so where did it come from? When did it start? Why is it that it's so broadly accepted today? And on the other hand, are there other ways to think about menopause? For example, this big question that I had is, why do we even have it? And I was sort of vaguely aware that anthropologists and evolutionary biologists had, that it's an issue And once in a while, you'll hear, something in the news, but I didn't know where we were with that now. And I didn't know, again, how all of it fits together, how that story fits with the concept of menopause that we have, because they don't really fit together. So, so those were some reasons. Again, I was sort of something that was becoming really relevant to me. I had a lot of questions about it. I actually looked for a book that would answer these questions, right? And there wasn't. There were like thousands of books on, what pills to take and hormones and, medicines and alternative medicines and all of this stuff. And I just was not interested in that at all. Those weren't the questions that I had. And then there were another 1,000 books on sort of what I call wise woman advice, which, I mean, it's fine. But again, that's not what I was looking for. Yeah. So I realized that I would have to write the book in order to get the answers to my questions.
Yeah, so you wrote the book you were looking for, and so
that's right. Well, I realized, there isn't this book, so I am going to have to write the book.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, maybe before we get to the first part, maybe let's just, if you want, maybe we can, if you feel it's better to work backwards, we can do that too. But maybe just give us, I guess, your understanding or definition of what menopause is and how do you define it. I know you wrestle with that again in the third part of the book.
Yeah.
How do we typically, if you're in a room with, 10 or 15 other women, everyone's going to know kind of what you're talking about. So how do you usually define menopause and what does it kind of look like for you?
Sure. So one thing I try to make clear in the book is there's really two ways that we use that word. And the most common way that we use the word, when I hear somebody say menopause or they're going through menopause or whatever, I've never had anyone say they don't know what the word means or they don't know the word. Even people who say, I think that they don't know anything about it, know that there's this thing and it has this name. And they even know usually more about it. And what they usually know is they think they know it's a medical condition and that it has symptoms. And when people say they're going through menopause, they usually mean the symptoms that they think are associated with menopause. That's sort of the most common way the term is used. And when doctors want to be really specific that that's what they mean, instead of, they say menopausal syndrome, which means the symptoms associated with menopause. But we usually in common, discourse just say menopause, meaning menopausal syndrome. And that's the concept of menopause that I was talking about before, that you don't really see in pre-modern texts, and certainly not in the not in the cultures that I study. They don't have menopause in that sense. Yeah. However, there's another meaning of menopause. The other meaning of menopause, and sometimes this is what we mean, is just the end of menstruation when we're no longer fertile. So the end of fertility and the transition to what I call in the book post-reproductive life stage. And and this is universal. Every culture that I've looked at knows that women stop bearing children in midlife. And usually they will put the end of fertility between 40 and 50. Sometimes they'll say, maybe up through 60 and so on. But they all know that women stop menstruating and stop bearing children in midlife. Those are cultures with written traditions and cultures with only oral traditions. So that is a sort of more universal concept. And sometimes that's what we mean when we say menopause. And that concept of menopause is real. It is absolutely true. Women do stop bearing children in midlife, long before they become old. And that is something that's hard to explain in terms of biology and evolution. And so a lot of really good, brilliant, really research and I won't say speculation, but, thought has gone into trying to explain why this happens.
Yeah, that's great. What you start doing in the first part of the book, which is all about the evolutionary history, is, well, you take it all the way back. I mean, you take it all the way back, right?
Yeah, we go back to 2 million BC.
Right.
This is my broadest, this is the broadest time period that I've tried to cover in a book, right? Yeah.
And what kind of just lay out for us, where do we first see kind of menopause? I mean, obviously we have a common ancestor with many of the great apes. Was it 4 or 6 million years ago? I can't remember now. And then, we have all the different iterations of that. We have Australopithecus, Homo erectus, we have Homo sapiens now, and then all of the other types of humans that aren't on the planet anymore. And so where do we understand other primates and then other animals and how they have some form of a post-reproductive life? Maybe just tell us about where we first see this, or where we can first have where we can plant the yardstick kind of sort of origins of sorts.
Sure. This is actually a really hard question to answer, but we can answer it in a broad sense, is that we know that menopause in humans is something that we do not share with our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. So menopause is something that developed for us sometime after we diverged from the lineage that we shared with the chimpanzees. That's all that we can really say. And in the book, I have some, kind of speculation discussion that maybe menopause is really unique to our species, Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens, whichever you want to call it. Yeah. But we don't know that. What we do know is that chimpanzees don't have menopause in that second sense that I was talking about. They don't have post-reproductive life stage, and therefore they don't have a transition to post-reproductive life stage. And the reason that we know that is that we now have a lot of, just in the last couple of decades, we have so much more information than we had before. We have new ways of measuring natural lifespan, and also post-reproductive lifespan that weren't invented before. So it was a lot harder to get at the answers to these questions before we had these modern instruments. So chimpanzees, and we also have a lot of demographic studies of different populations of chimpanzees. And demography means we're looking at statistics about birth and death and population growth and decline and so on. But in particular, we have enough statistics to be able to talk about, how long chimpanzees live and to compare the lifespan of a chimpanzee to the lifespan of a human. And when we're doing that, we need to know about humans not in modernized societies, which are sort of the equivalent of really protected societies, but humans living in the conditions on which natural selection has acted on us for most of our history. And that means looking at foraging populations, that is populations that still live the way that we used to live in the Paleolithic past. And also don't have a lot of connection to modernization, don't have a lot of influence from modernization or modern medicine or anything like that, still have pre-modern demographic patterns, as patterns of fertility and mortality that are typical of humans before the modern shift to modern demographic patterns, before the demographic transition, as it's sometimes called. So, and also we do have records from societies that kept records before the transition to modernization, before the demographic transition. So we have a fair amount of information about human populations before, about pre-modern human populations without modernization, and what our lifespan was like, and what fertility and mortality were like in those different societies, including very detailed demographic studies of some foraging populations, hunter-gatherer populations. Sure. So we have that data for chimpanzees, and that took a long time to gather, right? These are wild animals. They're fairly long-lived. Yeah. They're hard to even get a glimpse of, really. So we have people who dedicated their lives to getting that information about chimpanzees. And we have, and again, people who've worked very, very hard to get this really good data on human populations before the demographic transition. And what we have discovered is that chimpanzees just don't live as long as humans. So to use one of these modern instruments I was talking about for measuring natural lifespan, if you have a cohort of chimpanzees all born in 2021, for example, they're 95% of that cohort's years will have been lived by the time they're, oh gosh, I can't remember what it is, but it's in the low 40s, something like that. And for a human, it is 20 or more years longer. So when we're comparing natural lifespans, humans to chimpanzees, it's clear that chimpanzees just don't live as long as humans, and that something happened. Our lifespans lengthened beyond the time span of the chimpanzee. And most people think that probably our common ancestor with chimpanzees had that shorter lifespan. And what happened was we evolved a longer lifespan, but we did not evolve longer reproductive lives. So a chimpanzee who's 40 or 45, who's really old, is still having babies. And chimpanzees bear children all the way to they have very, very little post-reproductive life stage that we can measure. And as a funny sort of fun fact that comes up in the book is that male chimpanzees prefer old mates, like really old mates, like the older the better, probably because chimpanzees continue to bear children throughout life. But humans don't. We stop at that same age. The average age at last birth for humans in so-called natural fertility populations, that is in pre-modern populations with pre-modern fertility patterns, is about 40. So, and there's not really a ton of variations. It's usually between 39 and 41, 42. So we stop bearing children at the same time. Our lives evolved to be longer lives, but our reproductive lives did not evolve to match our natural lifespans. And because of the way reproduction works in human women, and also in most mammals and in other animals as well, you can have those two things evolve separately. So the natural lifespan will evolve according to certain constraints, and then the reproductive life will evolve usually to about the same length. But there's mechanisms where you can have those two things not match. That doesn't happen very often because we should not really, according to classical evolutionary theory, we shouldn't live past the point where we can reproduce. However, humans clearly live long past human women clearly live long past the age at which they can reproduce. The only other animals that really seem to do that are two species of whales. Killer whales, orcas, and the short-finned pilot whale, we think also has post-reproductive life stage. Very striking in those two species and in humans, and all other animals have very, very little. At least all other wild animals. There are a few species of domestic animals, and again, natural selection for the most part is not working on domestic animals. Humans are doing all the selection for them. So we tend not to consider those kinds of animals when we're in this kind of discussion. But it turns out that post-reproductive life stage is a feature that's kind of unique to humans. It appears to be a feature that we evolved after our separation from the line that we share with chimpanzees. And it's so striking that, the first theorists who started to get a sense of this felt that it probably had to be adaptive. There had to be some reason for it. Or else, because nature has been so good about matching reproductive lifespan to natural lifespan in almost every other animal, that when nature doesn't do that, there's probably a good reason for that. And there have been some really good theories about why that is. I think convincing theories about how that might have happened.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful the way you explain it, because it very much mirrors how it is in the book, which, when I was reading it, it's very easy to track and follow. And it's like, whoa, I think the average age in the modern era for women is 78 is the average now. And I think for men, it's a little bit lower, 72 or something like that. But even in other groups around the world where it is more analogous to how it was for thousands of years, they're still living longer, past, 40. So like you're saying, there's this post-reproductive life cycle. And
so, yes, I mean, this is actually maybe the most common thing that I'm asked is, isn't menopause something that just evolved with modernization because our lives got longer? And what I have to explain is that our lives didn't really get longer. Our natural lives didn't really get longer because, as it turns out, when we really look at those demographic statistics, the average life expectancies at birth are being driven by high infant and juvenile mortality in humans. So that a child that makes it to age 15 in a hunter-gatherer population usually has about a 50-50 chance of making it to 45. And someone who makes it to 45 on average is going to live 20 to 30 more years in those populations. So there's this, it seems that we are evolved to live to be about 70 or a little older. Our bodies as machines, that's the planned obsolescence on our bodies.
Yeah, that's really helpful because, you say, well, how much of this is a cultural evolutionary piece and how much of this is just maybe more endogenous to us as a human species of like, even in these conditions, we're still going to live once we get past a certain age, plus or minus 20, 25 years, which is a helpful delineation, which is interesting because, so this is one of the longer chapters in the book, which I've talked about recently. There's a book that just came, it's out in the UK, it's coming out in the US, called The Social Instinct, How We've Evolved for Cooperation by Nicola Raheny. It's fantastic. It's a great
I need to
book.
read it. I think I've heard it and I have, thank you for reminding me that I need to get hold of that book and read it.
You absolutely should. It's fantastic. She is absolutely lovely. I had her on my podcast a couple of weeks ago. It's a great book. And we actually talked about the grandmother hypothesis. And she was wonderful about discussing it, and she was also very interested in it. And we talked about it briefly. We had other things we were discussing. And so I made a note to myself to say, well, when I talk to Susan, I'll make sure to really park here on this because it's I know it's talked about at length in your book and a very powerful hypothesis. So maybe give us the overview of it, and then we can get into some of the details, because I also really enjoy this hypothesis.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not going to be as competent to talk about this subject as your previous guest, that unfortunately, and I really need to read her book because I'm very excited about that. But one thing that becomes apparent, and especially to someone like me, so my whole life I've studied agrarian societies, which can be extremely competitive, very violent, and they cooperate in other ways. But it's really striking to read the anthropology of hunter-gatherer populations, and how anthropologists really, again, just as menopause is a challenge to explain, and you have to think really hard, the challenge of explaining the extraordinary kinds of cooperation that we see in hunter-gatherer societies. And this really changed my view of what people are like, what humans are like, so-called human nature. Because for most of our history as a species, of course, agriculture was invented relatively recently. For most of our history as a species, people think we probably lived in social structures that are close to what we observe in hunter-gatherer societies. Cooperation is sort of the foundation of several of the most important theories of how menopause evolved explain it as humans are cooperating in one way or another. For example, grandmothers are cooperating to provide food for their grandchildren. So instead of just going out and foraging for myself and getting as much, as I can possibly get, and then, wheeling and dealing for the rest of it or whatever, really what I'm doing is I'm going out and getting food for myself, but also giving some of it away. And in particular, in this hypothesis, the grandmother hypothesis, I'm giving it to my offspring and their offspring, especially to my grandchildren. So this idea that humans transfer resources downward through the generations is something that is validated, seems to be typical of humans in all cultures, in all time periods, including our time period. If you look carefully enough, you see that we still do this really till very advanced ages. We are still giving resources to younger generations, often to our descendants, but as it turns out, also to, not only to our grandchildren, but maybe also to other relatives or also to other unrelated people in our group. Now, it is these transfers, what our theorists will call transfers, this transfers of resources, the stuff that we give away, that really helps explain how menopause can evolve. When you add that in to the math that models how lifespan, what longevity should look like, what our lifespan should look like, and what our reproductive life should look like. It turns out that in a species where humans are transferring resources downward, so that older people are giving to younger people, it is really helpful to have older people who are producing and foraging. Hunter-gatherers reach their peak productivity in their 40s and 50s. So older people who are very productive but not reproductive. They are producing, but they're not producing more consumers, because human children consume for a really long time before they are able to support themselves. So
yes,
we are a species where children are dependent. They're really dependent for a long time, and adults, and especially as you get older, you're giving more and more to people of younger generations. And with that math, again, it turns out to be very helpful to have older producers who are not reproducing, and it opens up a lot of really interesting strategies that we have for reproducing quickly, or for controlling reproduction, or for doing all kinds of things. It turns out to be a really flexible, really adaptable way to do it. And as some anthropologists put it, we are cooperative breeders, which means that not all humans reproduce. We delegate reproduction to a part of our population, and then the rest of the population just pitches in and helps. Mm-hmm. So that part of the reproductive part of our population, young women, reproduce really fast. Mm-hmm. But they do that with help from everybody else. And as it turns out, again, this is just so flexible. We can have really rapid reproduction when we need it. At the same time, when we don't need that, we can take that energy that we're putting into that rapid reproduction and maybe use it for something else, like technology or culture or any of the other, really bizarre things that humans do that make us so unique. So it's that extra energy that really is, that we see in post-reproductive women, that has given us the adaptability to, first of all, adapt to every environment. So in the Paleolithic, we colonized every part of the world. And also that, as I said, can be used for things like technology and culture.
Yeah, I think that one of the strengths of the grandmother hypothesis is that it does give an adaptive functionality of, okay, if humans have evolved in different ways than other primates, one question would be, well, why are women living past, the reproductive stages and living very long lives? I mean, 20, 25, 30 years. What would be the adaptive quality of it? Now, you want to be cautious, I think, of probably saying, well, is this a just so story, right? Something is happening, so we need to say, well, it's happening because, and here's the evolutionary explanation, always being mindful of that. But in this scenario, it doesn't, because of what you just explained in terms of all of the elements that we see through time with all humans, and even still today in the modern age, of this kind of this kin selection and cooperative breeding, because when there's a more collective aspect. So specifically, if grandmothers are helping as younger females are producing and they're having children, they're able to then care for the generation and the offspring, which allows more freedom, or there's more abilities to do other things for the nuclear family or for the group or the tribe, etc. And so is there any other things for the post-reproductive cycle, or with, anything that's post, menopausal, that can help with cooperative breeding that we know besides the grandmother hypotheses? Or is that the only game in town, or the only theory in town in helping us understand this kind of post-reproductive life cycle?
So there's several different, the grandmother hypothesis is probably the leading hypothesis about how menopause evolved. There are other hypotheses that, well, in the first place, so the levels of cooperation that we see in humans aren't just grandmothers giving food to their grandchildren, although that's really important. So it's not just that older generations are helping younger generations, but also we see some very striking kinds of cooperation we see in human hunter-gatherers is food sharing to an extreme extent. So there's some variation, but meat especially is something that, is shared just liberal. I mean, there's not a sense of, I killed this animal, so I get to eat it, or my family gets to eat it, or whatever. This is something that, again, people have struggled to explain. Also, shared childcare is another thing that people have observed across hunter-gatherer populations. There are some conditions where it doesn't work as well, but a common pattern is for children to mostly hang out in sort of age cohorts or during the day in sort of big play groups with some older children and some younger children. And usually an adult has to be kind of within earshot, in case a lion comes around or something like that. Right. And people are going to give me crap for this, but it's kind of like school. We do this today. We have this thing called school where our children spend all day. We have this cooperative childcare. Yeah. And we do that because this worked terrific for us for the 250,000 years that we were evolving as humans.
Right.
So there's these different, and there's there are theories that build on those kinds of cooperations that humans do and how they explain different aspects of who we are. And especially there's one really interesting theory that this kind of cooperative childcare, which, by the way, you don't see in a lot of other animals, explains why we're so smart. Because we have to be able to, children have to be able to engage different adults and switch back and forth and everything. And so, but that fits really well with something like the grandmother hypothesis, because, who is doing this cooperative childcare? Grandmothers are taking care of other people's children, not just their own children, and so on. So it's, menopause is part of a bigger picture of other traits of humans that kind of all fit together. Yeah. And especially the many different ways that hunter-gatherers cooperate in sometimes really extreme ways, extreme sharing egalitarian societies. So this egalitarian sharing sort of mobile nomadic economy that we had for so long and then we got away from with agriculture. But so that there's these qualities that humans have that are kind of unique and that fit together, and menopause is part of that bigger picture, and that made us so adaptable and so successful in some ways. And one thing I really liked about, I was really attracted to the theories that stress that we evolved in a really volatile climate situation. So really the last 10,000 years have been extremely unusually stable, warm climate. Yeah. But before that, we lived in a much more challenging environment, and our unique qualities are all qualities that allow us to adapt to changes or to extremes in climate, and so that make us really flexible. And we think that these different kinds of cooperation, our big brains is another one, our long lives is another one, and this sort of what do I call it? Cooperative breeding is one of them.
There's a part in the book it just stuck out to me because I think it's the kind of thing that we have kind of colloquially and within society, right? Which is this idea about mothers and daughters-in-law, so the grandmother and the daughters-in-law, and how they live in close proximity at different periods, and there is still this kind of push-pull that can occur even in the modern era. I don't know if you just want to briefly,
sure, yeah,
chat about that, because I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, no, the mother-in-law question is and I got, so in the middle of the book, when I was writing about agrarian societies, I got really interested in this mother-in-law issue and how there really is there's this huge gap in history in what I call mother-in-law studies. Nobody looks at this relationship. Nobody talks about the role of the mother-in-law, even though it's really obvious that it's really, really important. Yeah. And the reason is that nobody likes the mother-in-law, right? Your sources don't like the mother-in-law. You usually don't have a lot of sources written by mothers-in-law. There was one exception that I put in my book, which is really interesting. And your historians and your anthropologists don't like the mother-in-law either, so they don't really try to figure out what's going on. So as it turns out, so there's really good reasons why there's tension between daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law in agricultural societies.
Yeah.
In hunter-gatherer societies, it's a little different. So in agricultural societies, people are, for the most part, this is a generalization, but in most agricultural societies, people are living in what I'm calling the nuclear family. That is a married couple, their children, and in some societies also their parents, and maybe their male siblings and their siblings' wives. So if you're living with or near, and typically in agricultural societies, women go to live with the man's family.
Right.
So typically in agricultural societies, change females, and there's reasons why it might be advantageous to do that in that kind of economy. And this is sort of the whole foundation of the patriarchal social systems that we see in agricultural societies. So typically, a woman is living with her husband and her husband's mother, her mother-in-law. Right. And there are really good reasons why that might not be sort of a super ideal situation for her. The mother-in-law has, so they can have competing, the two families can have competing interests. Cross-culturally, the sort of the idea that the mother-in-law is sort of oppressive and bossy and demanding of the daughter-in-law is really common. That's usually how mothers-in-law are portrayed. In foraging societies, again, it's a little different because we don't really see, when people started looking for this, for a long time, people sort of assumed on not a lot of evidence that in foraging societies, the same thing happens. That is, women transfer to the group with their husband, right? They leave their own group and they join a group with their husband. As it turns out, that's not actually true. We don't really see that's a marked pattern in foraging societies. Foragers switch groups a lot. They're very opportunistic about who they live with. And there are some kind of customs and patterns that suggest that, for example, bride service is not uncommon in foraging societies. And that means that a man will have to do a lot of favors for his mother-in-law for a while after he gets married. And so in foraging societies, it's that relationship sometimes that's spoofed, is the man and his mother-in-law, and she's kind of demanding and bossy and so on. And so it's not unusual for that to happen. And so that in that case, it seems like, it's not uncommon, or it's maybe common, or at least not uncommon, for women to be living near their mothers and maybe in the same group with their mothers. And those are those grandmothers that are helping women to reproduce. But again, foragers are pretty flexible about who they live with and sort of opportunistic about that. Helpers it can be the grandmother, it can be other people as well. In agricultural societies, there's much more rigidity about marriage customs, about, who's moving where, and so on. And so there, we do have this oppressive mother-in-law story. When I looked, so I tried to do my best to learn, what I could. Is there anything we can really say about mothers-in-law? And the picture that I got, there's been a few anthropological studies, especially medical anthropological studies of grandmothers that have tried to include grandmothers, for example, in programs. Usually the aim of the program is to improve practices around childbirth and nursing for young women. And usually, Westerners go charging in there and they get all the young women in the town and lecture them for a while and, hand out pamphlets that they can't read. And then are surprised when it doesn't work. But there have been a few studies that really tried to include, the bosses, the mothers-in-law in those discussions. Yeah. And so what I learned from those is that it's sort of there's a sort of typical pattern of, how mothers-in-law perceive their own role, what they think their own job is, and that they really perceive their own role in all of these societies where these studies have been done as, as really they very, very serious about helping with childbirth and helping with care for the young babies. That they, of course, they give a lot of advice. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. Some of it the health professionals don't agree with. But when when in those few studies that have really tried to work with grandmothers have in general been more successful because they're talking to the people who are acknowledged, who believe that they have all the answers. And most in their culture, most people acknowledge that it's grandmothers who are the experts in medicine.
Mhm.
When we think about it, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, when there's not another source of knowledge except experience and decades worth of experience raising children,
Yeah.
And for example, if somebody gets sick in my household, they'll come to me and I'll look at it. And, I'd have to decide, are we going to the doctor or the ER or, which medicine? And it's my job. We didn't have Benadryl allergy cream the other day. And I was like, oh, that's on me. It's my job to do all this. So even in our own society, of course, yes, the older women in the household, maybe you don't like our advice and maybe we're bossy, but even with YouTube and even with Wikipedia and with everything, it's still, there still is that, we still play that role.
Yeah.
So I came away with a little more benign view of mothers-in-law after that. And when, I looked at some of these specific examples. So I really encourage people, I know that, this is the part of the book where people tend to skip, but really, look up mothers-in-law in the index and read that chapter. I'm trying to remember what chapter it is. It's going to be like chapter 10 or something.
Yeah,
and just, or no, chapter 8 or I don't know which chapter.
It's towards the middle.
Yeah, something like that. And because, there aren't people who there really aren't a lot of scholars who take mothers-in-law seriously. And it's important. We need to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was exactly what I walked away with as well. I mean, I think that that's really important to say, like, what the significance and what the importance of the mother-in-law is. And I always find it interesting when you have two families that get together and both grandmothers are in interaction with each other. I always think that's a really cool dynamic.
Yeah, that's always that can always be dramatic. Again, because of the new economy that we invented for ourselves with agriculture, and then we've carried forward a lot of the traditions from that into our modern economy, that relationship can be, there's reasons why that relationship can be tense.
Yeah. So I guess going to so the first part of the book is really on the evolution and the grandmother hypotheses and the cooperative breeding, interdependence, all these wonderful things that we've been discussing. And the second part is really about history. And so I think it's really important as well, because it is a lot of this movement of, okay, so how do we understand these aspects of women that are, gone through menopause or post-reproductive at this point for millions of years, and then how do we understand getting closer to the modern era? And so then you kind of walk us through, I think, first 1 or 2 chapters in the second part of going from what we understand from Australopithecus to Homo erectus to currently Homo sapiens, and how the role of cooperation, with the nuclear family. And then how it goes from nuclear family, kind of you already mentioned, to more agrarian societies. And so here's the big question I had from this one is how or why, I guess, do you think, I mean, you talk about it in the book, but centrally, what do you think was if you think it was functionality? Because I feel like there was some element of that in the book that you were kind of saying, and it just kind of took a life of its own. But we went from a nuclear family with very small family groups and tribes and forager societies to a patriarchal society in an agrarian system. Why do you think it ended up that way as opposed to a matriarchal society or some other combination? Maybe just
that's a really good question. So I guess the way that I would put it is that in hunter-gatherer societies, the nuclear family isn't that super important. The residential band of a few dozen people is obviously the main economic unit.
Yeah.
In agrarian societies, now we have a situation where the main economic unit is the family. And the family's economy is to, farm this usually hereditary plot of land, or, either owned or hereditary, right to lease this land or whatever. And so the whole economy is organized around that. So whereas in a foraging society, people go out and they get their own food and they share it and so on. In an agricultural society, people are trying to raise their own food. There's sort of transitional stages between these, we call horticultural societies and so on. But for most of the history of the agrarian period, we quickly progress to this stage where people are doing more or less different types of intensive farming that has its own sort of social structure that builds up around that. And because inheritance is so important, so you have now property. Now we have property, which we didn't have in the hunter-gatherer period. Now we have property. Not only that, our survival depends on our rights to certain kinds of property. And so that property has to be inherited. So now we have hereditary property. In that situation, there are reasons why you might want your sons to inherit rather than your daughters. One of the reasons is that, so now we have property, there is a lot of payoffs to different kinds of organized violence, feuds, raids, wars. There's lots of stuff you can go out and steal and take, and then also you have to defend that stuff. So who's going to do that? Well, in the previous division of labor, men were the ones who went out and hunted with weapons. And also, to be honest, they're the ones who have a little more time on their hands. So women are usually, they're out there every day digging up roots, feeding the kids. And the men are out there, they're trying to hunt something, but they're probably not going to catch it. So it's really, it's a little more optional. Their labor is a little more optional. So they're the ones that are going to do all this, aggressive, organized violence and defensive violence as well. So for men, then it's really helpful for them to be around the other men in their own family. And so when that seems to be the reason why in agrarian societies, usually it's the women who move and not the men. So given that that's what's happening, of course, you want your sons to inherit your property because your daughter's property is just going to take off with her to some other family. So you want to keep your property in your family, you have to have the sons inherit it. So in agrarian societies, it's very typical that men inherit and control property, and women do that much less. Sometimes they're shut out of property rights altogether. Sometimes they have some property rights, but usually men control most of the property, and all the rest of it flows from there. Right? That's the main reason we think why, it's such a pattern across agrarian societies. Patriarchy is such a pattern across agrarian societies. There are exceptions. There are a few that we know of, truly matriarchal societies where women own and control property and men, for the most part, do not. But they're, that's not the typical pattern.
Now, I think some people will listen to this and say, well, yes, and immediately have a negative valence, which I absolutely agree that for, hundreds and thousands of years, it definitely evolved with a negative valence. But it seems, maybe I'm not reading this right, and maybe it's the wrong question to ask, but that seems, in a sense, you can see the logic, right? In that,
there's definitely a logic. It's a compelling logic, and so the reason why it's so widespread is because it's such a compelling logic. The reason why that pattern of patriarchy is so widespread is because that's what, more or less worked the best for that agricultural economy. It's so widespread that a lot of historians and anthropologists have assumed that it's sort of the natural human condition. And it's really not until you look at hunter-gatherers and how different that kind of society is, you realize, it's not the natural human condition. It's just what tends to work best in agricultural-based economies.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of how I read it too, which was, okay, I see the logic of this. I wouldn't say that is, the natural way or the way. It was a way to do it. And
it's not something we need to continue, however. That's the point that I tried to make, is if we're living in a society with a modernized economy, we're no longer living in the kind of economy that gave rise to those patriarchal structures. We can do something different. And we even have a model of something different in our hunter-gatherer ancestors. So that's one thing I hope that people would take away from the book, is that this sort of dark vision we have of what humans are like, and particularly this idea, like patriarchy is sort of our natural state, isn't necessarily the case. There are other ways that we can understand human nature and our history.
Yeah, no, it comes through in the book, at least to me, in terms of your tone, because it wasn't this, well, was a patriarchal system negative or positive? It was this, and you could see some of how it was that way. And then we see how it became over time, which definitely was fairly pernicious and negative. But then how we can say we have different kind of epochs or dispensations throughout our human history to say, well, we could do it in different ways, and we have done it in different ways. And sometimes it may be more helpful for one, section of time, and then it isn't anymore. And so as we continue to evolve, we can find different ways of doing this, which kind of goes to these two questions on this section here are connected a bit, which is that there's a sort of gendered division of labor throughout our history.
Right.
And what Gladys, we were saying, from the horticultural to the agriculture, and then why this impacted mortality and fertility rates. So maybe talk about how the environments during these periods impacted kind of the menopausal time frame and how it impacted the mortality and fertility rates.
Okay. Again, this is a little bit controversial, and my answer is maybe not what you would hear from other people, but I read a lot of, scholarship, and I came up with, my own sort of synthesis conclusion that was maybe a little different from what most people would say. The gender division of labor is something that we see in hunter-gatherers. That in most hunter-gatherer populations, men tend to do hunting of large game, and women tend to do gathering other kinds of foods, and men with lots of overlap. So men will also go and gather all those foods on some days when they aren't able to catch anything, and so on. Sometimes women hunt small game, sometimes women fish. There's a fair amount of variation, but there does tend to be a division of labor. It's not necessarily the exact same division of labor in all groups, but there is a division of labor. And the same in agricultural societies, they continued that. So there's in every one that I know of, there's women's work and there's men's work. And what that division is can be different in different cultures. So, for example, in Greek, in the ones that I'm most familiar with, or in ancient Greek society, there was this sort of indoor-outdoor ideal that men did the outdoor work and women did the indoor work, and so on. And again, this was, something that there's that ideal. It's not necessarily the case that everybody actually did that, but there's this sort of ideology, and I think it is really important to understand that it's an ideology that men do some work and women do other work, and men's work and women's work. Women's work, some of the characteristics of women's work that we see is that it's unpaid work. So when usually it's more typical for men to go out and do wage work that brings in income, and for women to do the work that is not compensated. So that's one sort of division. A lot of scholars and anthropologists just have for decades would kind of study the division of labor on the farm and not even see women's work as work. So, there's a lot of really weird scholarship out there. I read a lot of scholarship peasant studies, studies about peasants, and all this emphasis on what the men are doing and not really getting the memo that it's tremendous, that women's work in any agricultural society is a tremendous amount of work, often usually including all of the food preparation, which when you're starting with something that you grow from the ground is, an enormous amount of work every day, and textile production. So taking, raw wool from a sheep and producing a blanket or a piece of clothing or something like that. So as you can imagine, these are extremely labor-intensive, skill-intensive tasks that became women's work in the agricultural period. They're still doing, a lot of the farm work as well, and of course raising all the children as well, but also so their workload increased greatly with the turn to agriculture, especially intensive agriculture, even as men's work also increased greatly with these new technologies and this new economy. So both men and women are working extremely hard. And again, there's this ideological division of labor. And there's reasons why in this very patriarchal society, where one of the features of this society is inherited wealth. So men are very concerned to control women sexually, especially, to make sure that all of the kids who are inheriting their land are their own children, right? Yeah. So agricultural societies tend to place a very high premium on, virginity, chastity, controlling women, draconian penalties for violation of that, and so on. And so there tends to be a pattern where women are doing the sort of the more indoor work that they can do secluded, if they can, if you have a household where you can afford that kind of division. Yeah. That's the most commonly articulated reason why, when we look in the sources about why women are doing this kind of work versus that kind of work, ideologically, it's because it keeps them separate from other men. So again, we see these sort of divisions of labor that grow out of the economy, the agricultural economy, that sort of, there's reasons why, they work within that economy. Again, I want to emphasize, though, that across cultures, there's variation in what is women's work and what's men's work. And one thing is very commonly, there's sort of a misunderstanding that, the idea that women don't go out and do farm work. And the ideal is maybe that they don't, but the reality is that, when it's time to harvest the wheat, everybody is out there with the sickle, and harvesting with the sickle, for example, it's almost typical women's work. You kind of the image of the old lady with the sickle in the wheat field. And then there's also the case that if somebody dies, if the man is off doing wage work or at war, or the woman dies or something, of course you have to do the other person's work. So it's not, or you can, maybe you can hire somebody, maybe you can buy a servant or a slave or something. But if you have to find a way around that. So the division of labor in agricultural societies is a really, really interesting topic. And again, one thing we learn is that maybe we don't really need to do that anymore. It was something that we did because that economy, it worked in that economy, and it also fit into the patriarchal values that were typical of those economies for good reasons, and that now we don't necessarily need. We can ask ourselves, do we need these same divisions of labor? And really we need to understand that gender is class because gender is labor. Basically, all of the attributes of gender are based on these, divisions. There's men's work and women's work going all the way back to our hunter-gatherer past. And we can really question, do we need that anymore? Or now we have a new economy. If we have a new basis for production, maybe we can rethink. Maybe we don't need those values and those concepts.
Yeah, I think my opinion on this is that I think the challenge for it, and it's just something that we're trying to figure out, is because of the like I said, the dispensations that these lasted. We're talking, there was not that much change from 1800 to 1900, but relatively speaking, 1900 to 1950 was like. And then 1950
it's very,
to
very rapid change.
Boom. Yeah. And then now even 2000 to 2010 to now, it's just all of this fast change where for hundreds of years there was no change. So it was like, or very minimal, I should say. And so I think that I think that's a thing that is something we're
reeling from it. And yes, and it's like modernization is very, very recent development. In most places, it happened in the 20th century, and not until the mid 20th century, and some places not till the late 20th century, and in some places it's still going on. One thing I was shocked to read, I didn't know before I wrote the book, is that 4% of people in the worldwide still farm for a living. Yeah. In our society, it's 4% because we have a fully modernized economy. But a lot of places in the world don't have fully modernized economies. And so a lot of people are still in food production, are still, halfway in the agricultural economy. So, so that's still ongoing. Modernization is still ongoing. It hasn't been happening for very long, and we don't really know how it's going to work out.
Yeah,
It's experimental at this stage, and it is. Things are progressing so fast that it is really important to, to think intentionally about the changes that we may need to make in order to make it work.
Yeah, and I think most people don't like change, and people usually resist it, and it's very hard. And my conversations with people is, sure, but something works for a time, and it's not going to work that same way for all time, and it's never been that way, especially if it's just happening faster. And some people are dragging their feet to come out of that. I guess the last one piece here, and then we'll get to the last section, because I really want to hear your thoughts on that, is you talk about the demographic transition with low fertility, low mortality, and then how that impacted women. You talk about that extensively in one chapter. So just kind of briefly tell us what that is and how that impacted, and then we'll get to the
So okay, this is probably one of the most important things that happened with modernization. I think maybe the most important thing that happened, and the one that we want to hang on to, is the demographic transition. So that means we went from a situation where mortality was pretty high at all ages, but especially for infants and children, where average life expectancy at birth, driven by those high infant and child mortality rates, were pretty low. Women had to have a lot of babies to reproduce the population, and there wasn't a lot of time for women to do other things. So most of our energy during our reproductive lives are going to producing baby after baby after baby. A lot of them, don't make it. And so in order to reproduce our families in a typical sort of pre-modern regime, well, there's wide variation, but it's usually going to have to be between 5 and 7 or 8 babies that we need to produce. That's a lot. And then also nurse, and also doing all the other farm work that we talked about. It is a lot. So, that's very hard. It's not something that most of us really want to contemplate, again, having all these children and also working extremely hard at other farm tasks. For some people, okay. And, and in societies where people are doing that, they usually value large families. But I think that for most of us in modern societies, most people with modernizations, most families have enthusiastically embraced the idea of fewer children. That is, when we see that we can reproduce our families with only 2 children, most people don't want more than that. Most people say, fine, great, I'm going to stop there. And what that does is that liberates all of that other energy that women, usually before had to put into a lot of children that were just going to die, and now can put into other things. And this has unleashed this tremendous productivity of the modern period is responsible for all the wonderful things we see around us, and also, is maybe going to destroy us. It's just this, the tremendous amount of energy that formerly was put into, again, reproduction for women, but also into producing humans that then, with higher adult mortality, only died and, didn't have a chance to accumulate experience, to transmit ideas. All of that is now conserved, and we are so much more efficient. So with lower mortality and lower fertility, we have so much more energy available for other things. We're capable of so much. And not only that those things are just nice to have. I mean, most of us prefer to live long lives. And most of us, most women, I think in modern societies, do prefer not to spend their whole lives bearing and nursing children, especially children who are likely to die. So I think that, those are things that have been great. These have been huge leaps forward for women and for people in general. And we want that, and I just you hear so much whining about the aging of the population. The aging of the population is good. There are certain features of our medical system that mean it's an issue and also, we have to talk about retirement and stuff like that. But, as an objective thing, the aging of the population is good. It means we're conserving all of that investment that we put into people, to young people, to bear children, to raise them, to educate them. You don't want that cut short. Absolutely. So that's a good thing. It's a really great thing. And we really don't want to go back to a situation with high mortality and high fertility where we're putting all of our energy into reproduction. dying younger, losing children. And we can all agree, I think, that we don't want that. So that's what there should be some sense of urgency about that.
Mm-hmm.
There are things we want to hold on to about modernization that have really transformed who we are and that we don't want to go back to. And this is one of them. This is maybe one of the main things. So we really need to think about, again, I think fairly intentionally about, are we willing to go back, or do we want to take steps to make sure that we can preserve the benefits of modernization, ideally for everybody, and what are the important ones, making sure that everybody shares in those important benefits. And then maybe there's other things we don't need as much.
Yeah, no, I really like the way you explained it. And you do the same in the book, which, again, reading it, I was, just kind of really hit me. And I was like, whoa, this is a really powerful, transformative thing for women. And then like, not just for women though, but it's also for everyone in society, and how it really is very, I see it as a net positive. And so I think it's super important. Last part of the book, which was the most interesting, it's all interesting, but it was the one that I was even like, do I agree with this? So I didn't agree one way or the other, I don't think, but
yeah.
I love it though. I love it. Okay. The best thing about the third part of the book on culture, I really, I don't know. You're a historian, so I shouldn't be surprised, but I feel like a lot of people in the West, United States, Canada, maybe Western Europe, we have a very parochial kind of mindset of looking at the West. And you do such a nice job of using really good examples from China and other countries about looking at how do we understand culture and what is the influence of culture on menopause. And and the big question is that you pose, I think it's in one of the chapters, is menopause a real thing in one sense? You kind of like the two senses you talked about in the beginning, is it just a cultural syndrome that we have? And you talk about how really until 1700, it wasn't even written about. It wasn't even really talked about, in our historical text in the way in which we understand it now. It's very sparse. And is this just a thing that occurs that we had to name, and it's just a cultural phenomenon, or how do we understand kind of the reality of it? So maybe lay out your hypothesis or your thesis on in this section.
So when I started writing the book, I didn't really know that I was going to make this argument. Just the more that I learned about menopausal syndrome, this sort of that first definition of menopause that I talked about, what we mean when we say menopause, that is all the symptoms, the syndrome. It sort of came together with other research that I'd done in the past on cultural syndromes. And I started to realize menopause really is not only, looks like a cultural syndrome, it really looks like a classic example of one. So it fits the pattern extremely well. So I will, first of all, start by explaining that cultural syndromes are real. They are dead serious. They're absolutely real. They cause tremendous suffering. They don't tend to cause a ton of mortality, but they do cause a lot of suffering. And they're important socio-historical phenomena. So we can look into the past and see cultural syndromes from past cultures. We can see cultural syndromes in other cultures. We're less good at seeing cultural syndromes in our own culture. We widely acknowledge, we're fine acknowledging, that there are cultural syndromes like Hwabyung in Korea, which I'll talk about a little bit. And, our irritable heart in Civil War veterans. But if you're a historian, you know that. Otherwise, you probably don't. But we're much less comfortable acknowledging that, 21st century United States, in the 21st century United States, we have cultural syndromes that have the same kind of, that cause the same kind of suffering and have the same kind of status. So the story with cultural syndromes is that we are so smart, humans are so smart, that the way we experience just about any disease is partly shaped by culture, by things, by things external to ourselves, social factors, beliefs, values, our models about how the body works, ideas about disease, all kinds of things. These influence how we experience any disease, and you may have read, people with very similar, organic conditions in heart disease or arthritis or whatever will experience them very differently for reasons that we don't fully understand, but probably have something to do with these external outputs and cognition, how we think.
Yes.
And so it's not the case that those conditions aren't real, and it's not the case that we don't suffer, but cognition is playing an important role in how we experience them. And there are some conditions where cognition is even more important. And so one thing that is very typical of humans, so cultural syndromes can be hard to treat because they involve the body and the brain sort of working together and creating these feedback loops that I'll explain. So some diseases, some conditions have a relatively large input of cognition and culture into how we experience them. And the way this can happen is that so again, we have there's a sort of constant background noise or white noise, some scholars call it, of sensations that we're experiencing all the time. Some of them we're aware of, some of them we're not aware of. Some of them may be caused by things like hormonal fluctuations, right? Maybe we do feel, you may feel hot. They may cause us to feel hot. They may cause us to feel nauseous or whatever. But a lot of what happens next depends on how we interpret those feelings. So, because what can happen is, so we experience a feeling, and then our brains sort of, usually unconsciously, make a decision about whether it's significant or not, whether it's just a feeling or whether it's a symptom. A symptom is something that has significance, right? So we're probably not going to think something's a symptom unless there's something out there that's telling us, oh, this is significant, it's important, maybe something that's going to make you miserable, maybe something that'll kill you, or it means this or it means that. So, for example, if I feel hot on a spring day and I'm 25, I probably don't pay any attention. When I feel hot and I'm 51, I think, oh, I'm having a hot flash because I know that word. I know that I'm 51. I know there's this thing out there called menopause, and I know that heat sensation is important. And then what happens is that because of that, I have a response to that, a physiological response to that. And if I have any kind of feeling of stress, or even just attention can do this, but if I have any kind of anxiety or stress associated with that, because heat sensations are something our body may generate when we're anxious, it'll make it worse. So when we're anxious or afraid of something, and sort of anxiety is sort of low grade, long-term fear. We have these physiological responses to that. And there's some pretty weird stuff that our bodies can do. But in general, we're doing the fight-flight response, right? And, people describe it differently now, but it's autonomic nervous system arousal. So, or sympathetic nervous system arousal. The sympathetic nervous system is the one that gets us keyed up to meet a threat. And it involves all kinds of things. All kinds of things can happen. But it's a lot of things, but it's not infinite. So there's a large number of symptoms that if we perceive them and we feel anxious about them, might get worse just because we're feeling anxious, because that anxiety is going to amplify that symptom. And then that symptom seems even more significant.
Right.
So, and whole conditions can arise this way. So depending on how you think the body works, depending on what you think is important, depending on what you think you're supposed to be afraid of, or what you think you're likely to, you're supposed to be experiencing for whatever reason, pretty specific conditions can arise. And for example, one of the researcher who's contributed, I think, most to our understanding of cultural syndromes is at Harvard, and his name is, I'm blanking on the name. Hang on. Do you know the name? This is the chapter I didn't get to.
Is it particularly on cultural evolution?
Yeah, it's on cultural syndromes, and he's done. David Hinton of Harvard University, and so and he studied condition among Cambodian refugees, where the belief was that the dizziness we sometimes feel on standing up is a symptom of a potentially fatal attack where wind is escaping through the vessels of your neck. And so in that case, dizziness and neck pain are, dire symptoms and really important. And they're the kind of symptoms that when you feel them and you're anxious about them, they might get worse. And so there's this very specific wind overload condition called wind overload that is typical of Cambodian refugees that is part of that involves this sort of ethnophysiology, beliefs about how the body works, and a tradition that this disease exists, and so on. And when you read these articles by David Hinton, you're like, oh yeah, that is so convincing. And then what's really hard then to do, but what we're not as good at doing is saying, menopause is exactly like that. Because most of the symptoms that we associate with menopause are in exactly that category of conditions that get worse when you worry about them, or when you pay a lot of attention to them, or when you feel that they are important, right? So, in fact, every single one. So there's menopause checklists. There's checklists of menopausal symptoms that run into the dozens of symptoms.
Yeah, these are self-report measures.
Yeah. Category, yes. The kind that will escalate in these feedback loops and create a really specific kind of syndrome that we call menopausal syndrome. So this isn't to say that that there are no that hormonal changes have no influence. They don't have any physiological, there's nothing, they don't cause any sensations that we might feel. But what it does mean is that our concept of menopausal syndrome, I think there's a pretty good case that our concept of menopausal syndrome is a big part of how we experience menopause and why we experience it as a thing that we pay attention to, as why I take those sensations and I think, oh, that's a hot flash. Actually, don't have hot flashes by the current definition of hot flashes, this is a whole side thing, is like, what is a hot flash? And and there's a whole comparison between hot flash and panic attack that I just thought was really fascinating. But in any case, that menopausal syndrome, I think the reason why we don't see it in other cultures is that, there's not that cultural input telling you, oh, this is important, that's important, and then amplifying the symptoms that way. Whereas in modern culture, we have that input saying, oh, this is menopause, this is menopausal syndrome, you're going to have this symptom and that symptom and that symptom. And even with all of that input, by the way, a lot of people don't have symptoms. Also, it's hard to prove that any particular symptom does actually correlate with menopause, especially across cultures, especially across Western and non-Western cultures. In fact, there's some variation in the way people understand and also experience menopausal syndrome in Western cultures versus non-Western cultures, where nevertheless there's enough modern medicine that they know what menopause is, but it's like a different set of symptoms, right? And there's really interesting stories about, we can sort of trace the exportation of menopause from Western medicine around the world, in some cases, to China, to Japan, places that didn't really have a concept of menopause before, of menopausal syndrome before, but adopted one that in some ways resembles Western menopause, but has, again, sort of its own sort of variations in the symptoms that you might experience.
Yeah, and you do this nicely in the book where you talk about this kind of, it's not a false dichotomy, but there is this kind of, how do we understand what modern medicine has shown us, and then what traditional medicine has shown us, usually from the East and other places in non-Western culture. But I guess the thing that you could say of what menopause is, after looking at all of the evolutionary aspects in the history and culture, is that it is a transitional period, I guess you could say, for a woman, where they have the cessation of menses and the menstrual cycle, and they are no longer viable for having offspring. That is true. And
Yes.
in that transitional phase, some women, or many women, if you want, can have they could potentially have a menu of symptoms as their body is going through that transitional period. Is that fair to say?
Especially because they expect to have those symptoms. Right?
Right.
Especially because everybody's telling you you're going to have those symptoms.
Right.
So what
right.
I want to do is not get bogged down in this, discussion of, they real, and then of course the symptoms are real. Of course the suffering is real.
Sure.
And, and where do they come from? But, what if we just didn't really pay too much attention to that, and we thought about menopause in a different way? And we thought about menopause as being, again, we thought about post-reproductive life phase as something that's really important to humans. It's almost unique to humans.
Yes.
It's a really important part of who we are. It's a really important part of our success. And, we'll see. And it wouldn't surprise me if we thought about menopause differently, and not as a deficiency disease and condition, which is how we talk about it now. If we thought about it that way instead of the other way, I wouldn't be totally surprised if we experienced it differently. But, I don't want that to be the whole emphasis, is that I'm telling people that people think I'm telling them their symptoms aren't real. And that's absolutely not what I'm saying. Your symptoms are very real. You don't know. Cultural syndromes can make us very sick, very miserable, and they can be hard to treat because our bodies get into it. They, now you have this whole, our nerves are rewired, our brains are rewired. They're doing this thing, and it can be hard. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes, as soon as you understand that something is, that your brain is sometimes that cures it. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times it doesn't. It can be hard to treat because, medicines aren't really going to help. And it can take a while for your whole nervous system to get untangled from this cultural syndrome.
Well, you did it there. So my last question for you is just that. You kind of started it, which was answering it, which is, what are the best ways to discuss the phase of menopause in our current society? I mean, there's so much lack of information, stigma, confusion. I mean, again, like I was saying from the beginning, if I bring this subject up, women usually have two responses, like you're a dude, why are you talking about this, why are you bringing this up? And then they'll kind of like brace for impact because they're like avoiding this like period. And so what do you think are the best ways or the most helpful informational ways of accurately describing another period for women?
This is like, it's really painful for me to hear people talk about menopause because I just want to say, you're wrong. Everything you think you know about menopause is wrong because we think it's it's stigmatizing. It's embarrassing. It's an embarrassing women's medical condition that's going to make you miserable. It means that we're useless. We've outlived our natural usefulness to the species. All of those things are wrong. They're completely wrong. And so what I want to do is, like I said, substitute this other understanding of menopause. So I wrote the book. Now I have I don't think of menopause as embarrassing or as mortifying or anything like that. I just think of it as a super interesting subject. And all those things that I talked about, something that is, unique to humans that we have for a really good reason. We have menopause because we need it, and that, and that's been, I think about this evolutionary explanations of menopause and how they explain so much about who we are and about human nature. And, there's no need when we understand the role that menopause has played in our history, and we understand what it really is, we don't need to have the fear and the stigma and the embarrassment. We don't really need any of that. And so, and that's a kind of suffering that we can alleviate. We don't need to think about menopause as a bad thing. We don't need to be afraid of it and so on. I also feel like, there's been a lot, well, actually, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of the, medical rabbit hole and so on, and how much unhealthier we are without all that estrogen that I just feel like, the main thing that I hope we would accomplish is like, stop being embarrassed, stop being afraid, understand menopause in this different way, understand the importance of post-reproductive life stage, and then see how we feel. Right?
Yeah. No,
that's the kind of suffering we can definitely address.
I
and we
totally
didn't really talk
totally agree with you.
about, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, what were you gonna say? What were you gonna say? Sorry.
We didn't really talk about how menopausal syndrome was invented. I don't know if you wanted me to address that.
Sure, of course. Yes, please.
So I'll
Yes,
just
please.
do that really briefly in case you need it for, to fill in that gap. So why we have menopause in Western medicine, but not in other medical traditions until Western medicine is exported around the world.
Yeah.
So menopause arises in Western medicine really even before the modern period. So before we have modern medicine, we have menopausal syndrome. And we first see it in the 18th century. So, and it's really striking. So in the 1600s, it's really hard to find any references to menopause or the idea that women are going to get sick around the time when they stop menstruating or stop being fertile. Mm-hmm. It's just not a thing. There's nothing there. In the 18th century, suddenly we have this condition. It even has a name. It's 100 years before it really has a name, but people start talking about conditions and diseases that arise around the end of menstruation, right? And that's how sort of long kind of phrase is how it's often phrased in medical textbooks, and it's in all the medical textbooks. It's in people are advertising remedies for it. It has nicknames. It has all this stuff. So it's this new syndrome that really burst on the scene in the 18th century. Mm-hmm. The place we see it first is in male formally trained male physicians, doctors are talking about it. Mm-hmm. I don't have really compelling answers to why they start doing it. But that's where it starts. And it's clearly one of several syndromes. So medicine at this time, in Europe at this time, features lots of really similar kinds of syndromes. So melancholia is probably one you've heard of. Hysterical suffocation, later called hysteria, is one that you've heard of. Green sickness is one you might not have heard of, but it's another example of a new disease that, again, rises very suddenly. Suddenly everybody's talking about it. So these kinds of syndromes are really common in early modern European medicine. And menopause is clearly a syndrome in that category with these syndromes. It's exactly like it. It has the same kinds of, sort of lurid descriptions of behavioral symptoms. It's associated with all kinds of really generalized symptoms and conditions, and some of the epilepsy, scurvy, all kinds of things, different kinds of people. As in the 19th century, people got really interested in the nervous system and the brain and behavioral stuff, and they start talking about that a lot more. Sort of these semi-vegetative states or psychotic states or things that they associate with menopause because it's a syndrome. Yeah. So it's I see it as again sort of one of these early modern European syndromes. Unlike the other ones, it didn't go away for various reasons in the 20th century. It actually got a lot of boosts as it became part of modern medicine. Modern medicine, again, it's the only one that we still talk about. Right. And for various reasons, it's complicated to explain. It is still with us. But it's invented by those same guys in the 18th century that brought us hysterical, the modern version of hysterical suffocation and so forth.
Yeah, I think that was what was so strange, was that we didn't see this. Weird. We didn't see this before, or at least not documented, I should say. Yeah. And then all of a sudden it comes up, and then it was a nice feature that you placed, because it really does drive home this idea of, well, is menopause this kind of cultural syndrome thing that we're in the West? Is this something that we've not made up, but it's a thing of, how we're calling it this, and then how we're looking at it with some type of negative valence? Is that maybe some of the origins of that? And so I think you starting with that is a really helpful way of kind of saying, maybe this is kind of what this is. And kind of like some of the stuff we've been saying before, it doesn't have to be that way. Maybe there's a different way of looking at and understanding this.
Yes.
I have to say, Susan, you are such a joy to talk to. Really, I have absolutely enjoyed myself so much talking to you. You're obviously brilliant and just really excellent at explaining all of this content. So you've been absolutely tremendous and very generous with your time. So I appreciate that. Where can people find you if you want them to? Where can they read your stuff and get your book or anything else that's relevant?
Oh, yeah. So my book is available from Princeton University Press, and it's in paperback now.
Nice.
So it should be pretty easy to buy. I think it's also, there's an audiobook as well, if people prefer that. And I think it's also in Kindle, if you like that. And I am at the University of Georgia in the history department. And if you just Google me, you'll see my webpage with my email address and so on, if you want to send me a note.
Do you have anything that you're working on at the moment, and a new book or anything like that? Or
I have a project I'm not very far along with, but my next project I think is going to be a history of property. I got so cool. interested in that, that juncture in our development that I want to learn more about where property comes from and what are the earliest forms of property and so on.
Yeah, that's super cool. Well, again, Susan, thank you so much. This was a blast. And I hope everyone really enjoys it. I'm pretty sure they will. So I greatly appreciate your time and your mind.
Well, it was great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Of course, anytime.